के बाद पतली गलियों में जाना था, साइकिल रिक्शे पर बैठा करके मैं उनको वहाँ लेकर के गया। शबराती की नहारी चितली कब्र पर हवेली आजम खान में खूब जम के खाई, मसाले भी ख़रीदे और कहा कि क्या कुछ बम्बई ले जाने का इसका इंतज़ाम हो सकता है। तो मैंने कहा साहब ज़रूर, डीप फ्रीज करा दी जाएगी। वापस आके कार में बैठे तो मुझसे पूछने लगे कि चांदनी चौक में एक मिठाई की दुकान है, छेनाराम सिंधी हलवाई, क्या आप वहाँ कभी गए? मैंने कहा जी, आप चलना चाहेंगे? बच्चे की तरह खुश होकर बोले मज़ा आ जाएगा। वहाँ पहुँचकर उन्होंने कुछ मिठाइयाँ चखीं, कुछ पैक कराईं और दुकान पर बैठे शख्स को उसका पूरा ख़ानदानी शजरा बताते हुए कहा कि तुम्हारे दादा के ज़माने से यहाँ आ रहा हूँ और तुम्हारे एक चचा क्रिकेटर होते थे, उनसे भी मेरी शनासाई थी। उसी दिन शाम को जब उनका लेक्चर सुनने के लिए मैं कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन क्लब पहुँचा तो वो हामिद अंसारी साहब और शंकर अय्यर साहब के साथ बैठे हुए गुफ्तगू कर रहे थे। मुझे इशारे से पास बुलाया, एक अखबार पे कोई नंबर लिखा हुआ था उसे मेरी तरफ बढ़ाते हुए बोले, किनारी बाज़ार में हज़ारी लाल जैन खुरचन वाले की बड़ी मशहूर दुकान है, अगर वहाँ से कुछ खुरचन मिल जाती तो मज़ा आ जाता। ऐसे थे हमारे नूरानी साहब। So now, without further delay, now I would like to invite our guest. Our first speaker is Siddharth Vardarajan, noted journalist and founder of the Wired magazine. Noorani Sahab was very fond of Siddharth and always showered him with affection. Siddharth, please come.
Thank you very much, Qurban, esteemed guests on the panel, and friends and fellow admirers of Ghafoor Bhai, A.G Noorani Sahab. Whichever name or identity or you knew him by, what is unmistakable is that for an astonishingly long period of perhaps 7 decades, this man of letters, this jurist, this man of conscience, held sway over the public discourse of the Republic. There was hardly any event of import, whether in the realm of constitutional matters, domestic politics, foreign policy, or on the international stage, that Ghafoor Bhai, from the late 50s, early 60s on, did not have an opinion on and did not express that opinion eloquently and forcefully. I first got to know of Ghafoor Bhai's erudition quite late in his life. I was perhaps in my 20s, a graduate student in New York, and an occasional contributor to Frontline magazine. I see the editor of Frontline in the audience. In the 90s, I used to contribute from New York, and in those days, there was of course no email or you submitted your copy by fax, and if there were corrections, they were communicated back, and the editor would tell you that your piece is going or not. And of course, the moment of anxiety once the fax went was to then wait with bated breath for the printed copy of Frontline to appear, which you could pick up either in Queens or Little India on 27th Street. And I remember the first time, I think I wrote a piece on the extension of the NPT, 1999. And the first time I picked up a copy of the magazine which had my piece in it, apart from my piece, of course, there was Ghafoor Bhai. And there was hardly any edition of the Frontline back in those days, and for a long period of time, where he didn't write. And of course, I got to meet him when I moved back to India in 95, and we became, I would say, good friends. We discussed many matters of importance, concern to him. And I tried to be of as much assistance as I could, because I could sense whenever one met him that one was in the presence of somebody very deeply engaged and deeply concerned about what was happening in the country. And like Qurban or Iftikhar or his other friends, we were part friend and part local informant. Being in Delhi, he would tap us for information, he would tap us for access to documents that were in the public domain if you were a journalist in Delhi or if you were somewhat tech savvy, but Ghafoor Bhai, being what he was, had no way to access these. And so that's how our friendship grew. A lot has been said over the last couple of weeks, last 2-3 weeks since he left us, on the different aspects of Ghafoor Bhai's expertise, his affinity and close admiration for and respect for the people of Jammu and Kashmir is something that I want to highlight, and it's been spoken about. But having written an obituary for The Wire and having spoken at his memorial in Bombay last week, I was thinking on this occasion to highlight perhaps just one or two aspects of Ghafoor Bhai's approach to public affairs, which is certainly worth emulating by any of us who write on these matters, but which really stands out as something truly remarkable. And I think people have spoken about his courage, his forthrightness, but the sharpness with which he would comment on as sensitive a matter as the judiciary. He was from the bar in a country where the higher judiciary is known to be extremely prickly about comments and criticism that cuts to the bone. And yet, consistently, when criticism was needed, he would never hesitate to express it. His criticism was always well phrased, well couched, deeply researched, well argued, amply referenced, particularly if he was critiquing a judgment of, say, the Indian Supreme Court, amply referenced by citations from the Indian Apex Court itself, but also from well-respected judicial authorities around the world. And once having taken a stand, once having argued a certain position, you could really be quite unforgiving. Qurban spoke about how maafi उनके vocabulary में शायद कभी वो एक लफ्ज था ही नहीं. And I remember having many arguments and discussions with him about Justice J.S. Verma, illustrious member of one of the, I would say, most important Chief Justices of India. And he would, if I were to say that in him, he would amend that to say, probably after he retired. Because Ghafoor Bhai was a staunch critic of the Hindutva judgment and held it to be singularly responsible for many of the ills in Indian public affairs subsequently. And I think perhaps history has borne him out. I have reason to believe that Justice Verma himself deeply regretted the consequences of that judgment. Perhaps they were quite different from what he intended. But Ghafoor Bhai was unsparing, so it didn't matter the good work in the NHRC subsequently or in other public matters, but that one judgment was something that he held against him. And he's, as I said, a fearless commentator, and often, when you go back and, for example, just day before, I was quite struck by, and I hope the chair forgives me for ranging into very contemporary affairs, but I was quite struck by a U-turn that the Collegium took the other day, where the Collegium had recommended the transfer of 3 judges as Chief Justices of 3 particular High Courts. The centre sat on the file for 2 months and conveyed some so-called sensitive material to the bench in a sealed cover, following which the bench reversed its recommendations for those 3 judges and sent them to different high courts. In the life of the court, this may be a very small episode, but it goes to the heart of Ghafoor Bhai's sense of dissatisfaction with the way in which the judiciary functions and the way in which judges are appointed and the way in which the collegium functions. And he was, of course, a critic of efforts by the executive to reform the system of judicial appointments in a self-serving way. Exhibit 1 being the proposed NJAC. But he was also an unsparing critic of the way the collegium functions, and he never hesitated to speak his mind. Sometimes, perhaps in the longer sweep of history, a suggestion he may have made or a stand he may have taken may have been misplaced or misguided. I was reading recently the draft of P. Shankar's autobiography. It's not been published yet, but I had access to an early draft. And P. Shankar, who was Law Minister in 1980, has a section in his autobiography. And I was quite struck and also proud in a way because, as I said, my association with Ghafoor Bhai begins in the late 90s. And so there's a section in P. Shankar's autobiography where he talks about a reform that he introduced as minister in 1980, mandating that the Chief Justice of the High Court should not be from that particular state, but should be from some other state. And he cites the fact that this proposal of his was bitterly attacked in an op-ed by A.G Noorani, saying that this would go against the grain of the basic structure of the constitution and so on and so forth. And of course, Shankar explains why he disagreed with what Noorani wrote. And then he points out how, subsequent to this reform in 1980, the fact that in many high courts you had chief justices who practiced their method of judge selection in a very parochial, even casteist and regionalist way, how that process kind of eventually came to an end, at least in many high courts. And I think today, looking at the relative diversity in some high courts that you have, not perhaps as much as P. Shankar would have envisaged, or a plural society like India may want, perhaps Ghafoor Bhai would also have conceded that point, that in the longer sweep of things, the reform may have intended something positive. But I was struck by how, in decade after decade, if you want to know the arguments that got under the government's skin, you have to read A.G Noorani. And that's no mean feat for somebody to have held that position as an observer and a critic for 6-7 decades. Final point. Again, speaking to the Catholicity and sort of the broad nature of Ghafoor Bhai's method of inquiry and his ability to speak honestly and dispassionately about public affairs. Mr. Noorani was no great fan of Israel. When it came to the subjugation of the Palestinian people, their humiliation, the illegal Israeli occupation and so on, Ghafoor Bhai wrote about it. He was a critic. But that didn't stop him from appreciating if a particular judgment of the Israeli Supreme Court came out on an important point of law. His opposition to the political project of Israel, his opposition to the Israeli policies against the Palestinians did not come in the way of him trying to extract a kernel of universality from a particular judgment, say, of the Israeli Supreme Court. One of the pieces that we ran of Ghafoor Bhai, it's my great regret that I could not poach Ghafoor Bhai from Vaishna, from Frontline. He remained loyal to that magazine. But occasionally he would write for us. And one of the last pieces he wrote actually was that Modi should learn from Israel as to how a society debates the functioning of the army. And I think this was shortly after Pulwama or after the so-called surgical strikes or whatever, when there was a huge controversy about the fact that, oh, how dare the opposition question what the army has done, the efficacy of it, and so on and so forth. And he pointed to the fact that a heavily militarized society like Israel was still able to discuss and be critical of the way in which governments used military force without immediately being labeled anti-national, without being labeled unpatriotic, and so on and so forth. And he said this is a lesson. So I think that, perhaps many people would have blanched at the idea that, Israel is no country to learn a lesson from. And in many ways they're right. But, Ghafoor Bhai's, the wisdom of his approach was to see, and perhaps he was also being tactical, that here is a country that Mr. Modi says he admires, many people in India say they admire, so how come they're not following this aspect, right? So his ability to zero in on important arguments that emphasize the importance of transparency, of debate in public affairs, is something that's really peerless, unmatched. And he was, I think, remarkable intellectual and a public commentator for that reason too. And finally, a lot of us have spoken about his this sort of scholarly approach, the approach of a chronicler. How he was so methodical in gathering documents, in establishing a timeline, and all of that is true. But he was also a person who had a great attachment to the sense of justice. And so for him, whether it was writing on Kashmir or on many other matters, on the Babri Masjid controversy, the importance of human rights, the importance of secularism was central to his scholarship. And I think that's, again, something that those of us who have been his fans and followers over the years must really strive and struggle to emulate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Siddharth, for your rich tributes to late Noorani Sahab. We have with us many dignitaries, members of the diplomatic corps. We have Pakistan High Commission's Charge d'Affaires, Janab Saad Ahmed Waraish Sahab, and his other colleagues from the High Commission. We have former Foreign Secretary Shiv Shankar Menon, former Chief Election Commissioner S. Yaqub Qureshi, Kumar Danish Ali, former Member of Parliament, Tahir Mahmood Saab, former Member Law Commission and Chairman Minority Commission, and Begum Sahiba, Santosh Bharti Saab, journalist and former MP, Prabir Purkayas, editor News Click, Mark Tully and Julian Wright, Sanjay Kapoor, M.K. Menu, John Dayal Saab, and please excuse me if I forget to mention the name. Our next speaker is, because Noorani Saab was a crusader for human rights, with this legacy of him now, I would like to request noted human rights defender and senior Supreme Court lawyer, Mr. Colin Gonzalez. Colin.
I feel very diffident talking about Noorani Saab. I never met him. I read his books a long time ago. And when I compare his writings and his solidity and his erudition and his grasp and his patience, and I suppose his hermit-like work where he sits aside for a long time and writes his books, and I compare it with the work of my generation of lawyers, I feel so small as compared to Noorani Saab. And it's truly a generational decline, where I and my colleagues who do human rights work and are very vocal, it's a generational decline where we've lost the capacity to write a mixture, a very profound mixture of politics and law and history. To write that in a solid way for generations to follow. So when Qurban said, "Will you speak?" I said yes automatically, and then realized what a blunder I have made, and tried to put together something of sense for the meeting today. I want to start with a very small quote from his book on Article 370. few lines which I'll read out. Article 370 is not and cannot just be one-way stream. It has been brought into existence so as to invest the Constitution with requisite resilience in order to respond to ground situations warranting solutions, so that the relationship between the state and the union is placed on an even keel, in which aspirations of the people of the state would find satisfactory expression, in which the aspirations of the people of the state will find satisfactory expression. And today, after the pretty awful judgment of the Supreme Court on Article 370, and the way in which that judgment has been written, the lack of erudition in it, the lack of academic resolve and carefulness, I realize at least that there will be something in his passing that will remind us of what it is we do not have. When I read his books, I want to tell you about how important his writings are even today. Perhaps 20, 30 years later, how relevant they are to the issues in India today. He wrote on preventive detention with some vigor. And now we have, after many years, at last, after so many cases in Kashmir, where preventive detention cases last the whole term of 2 years without the court delivering judgment. So you file a case and you come out only because the court had no time to deal with detention cases. You have a judgment of the Supreme Court today, a slight turnaround, where the court says if you don't deal with the representation of the détenu, he must be released immediately. If you don't deal with it expeditiously, then forget the merits of detention, you must release him immediately. Extrajudicial executions he wrote on then, so relevant today. And you know the situation in Chhattisgarh in 2024, where 150 innocent tribals were extrajudicially executed by the Chhattisgarh police and the joint forces. No court is willing to look at it. Not even the Supreme Court, not even the High Court. The judiciary today is not willing to listen to it. And we went to Chhattisgarh and recorded the testimony of about 80 tribal women whose children and husbands and others were executed by the police. As relevant today as he was then. The death penalty, on which he wrote extensively. India today is as far away from abolishing the death penalty as it was when Noorani Sahib wrote. Across the world abolished, but in India no chance. Not even the slightest chance as long as the government remains in power. And when you saw and read about the killings, not the killings, the demonstrations in Kolkata, and the call for a death penalty for rapists, and the bill drafted by the West Bengal government, calling for the death penalty, again and again and again. You realize time has stood still. Ghaffur Sahib would today be as relevant speaking in audiences as he was then. Under trials he wrote on, and jails across the country have a 200% overcrowding. 200% overcrowding, a topic on which he wrote extensively. Anti-conversion laws, again, something very relevant today, where the petition against the anti-conversion laws is lying in the Supreme Court for several years. And the court doesn't have the time. It has the time for commercial matters. It has the time for insolvency matters. It has the time for everything under the sun, but it won't take up the matter of anti-conversion laws where people are put in jail because of the word used in anti-conversion laws, allurement. And for Christian, that means if you offer a person a place in a Christian school, or you give a person a chance to go to a Christian hospital and so on, that would come within the definition of allurement. Impunity, something on which he passionately wrote. And you know the latest case of the Nagaland army and the police in Nagaland, who killed a large number of people, mistaking them, so to speak, for being insurgents. Supreme Court took up the case, was told that there is no sanction for prosecution, sanction given by the same party who ordered the opening fire. Sanction is not given, sir, and the case is closed. The Supreme Court and its decline is something on which many things can be said, but maybe not today. Like the wrestlers case. Take it up today, insist with great gusto that an FIR be registered. The next day be told that the FIR is registered and the case is closed, without the accused being sent to jail. And in AFSPA, of course, he wrote quite a bit, not repealed, despite so many anguished calls from civil society for the repeal. Time really stands still. And I think Ali Saab, although he wrote many years ago, is as relevant today as he was then. And India doesn't become more civilized at all as the years pass. Becomes more rapacious, more violent, and more uncivilized. And the killings go on and on. I'd like to read one little thing from his book on Article 370. The people of Kashmir, who having suffered for long under Mughal, Afghan, Sikh and Dogra occupation, rejoiced on Independence Day only to suffer betrayal by the tallest leaders of India and Pakistan and their own leaders from Jawaharlal Nehru, Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Sheikh Muhammad Abdullah down to this day. And to the memory of Jai Prakash Narayan, who spoke up for the people. His call for Sampurna Kranti, Jai Prakash Narayan's call for Sampurna Kranti, total revolution, if it were to be made today, the maker of that slogan or the maker of that call would be taken for sedition. People have gone to jail in this country in large numbers, including our friend Khalid, who is in jail for making a provocative speech. Jai Prakash Narayan, had he made the call today, would certainly have been in jail. I use that phrase, total revolution, very often in our rallies and speeches. But I preface it by saying that Jai Prakash Narayan said it many years ago, and we should resurrect the slogan today, total revolution. In remembering Ghafoor Saab, I think we must remember that it is only a total revolution of the kind envisaged by Jai Prakash Narayan that will cleanse Indian society of the quagmire that we are in. Remember him with thanks and remember him with respect. Thank you all.
Thanks, Colin, and bravo to you for contesting human rights cases in the Supreme Court. We have some other distinguished guests. We have Mr. Najib Jung, former Lieutenant Governor of Delhi, Mr. Najmi Waziri, former High Court Judge, Commander Uday Bhaskar, Professor Rakesh Bhatbayal, Naved Bhai, Sajid Bhai, Professor Salim Qidwai, Andy Pancholi, Askari Zaidi, and Advocate Ajaz Maqbool. Now I would like to request a very distinguished and veteran journalist and former editor-in-chief of the Tribune, Mr. Harish Khare. He was a great admirer of Noorani Sahab. Harish ji.
Sometime in the second half of 1995, I was invited to interact with a small group of senior army officers on the very, very perennial theme of role of media in conflict situations. There were a dozen or so colonel and brigadier rank officers. I was doing my practice number, all the cliches about media and its recognized place in a democratic setup, etc., etc. The army officers were polite and courteous, but not terribly impressed with all this spiel about sanctity of freedom of speech, etc. The question-answer part began. Suddenly, a colonel asked, somewhat impatiently and rather rudely, why should this country allow this A.G Noorani to write all this nonsense about the army was doing in Kashmir? That, of course, was a time when the Indian state was engaged in an extremely difficult and demanding task of restoring its lost control in the valley, and it was not a picnic for anyone. Yet, the army officer's question was not palatable to me, nor was it pleasantly asked. Equally heatedly, I replied, A.G Noorani is exercising his right as a commentator under the authority of the same constitution which gives you and your colleagues here the authority to perform your assigned task in the Kashmir Valley. And for good measure, I added that it would be a sad day for our constitutional republic when A.G Noorani or any other unintimidated journalist will allow himself to be browbeaten by an army officer. The meeting ended not on very pleasant terms. By that time, I had never met Noorani Sahab. It was much later that I came to understand and appreciate that Abdul Ghaffur Noorani Sahab was a one-man institution. He was not much liked by the security establishment. Even the so-called liberals, more often than not, found him irritating because he had this really irritating habit of always anchoring his argument or contention in this or that constitutional principle or judicial pronouncement. He was not an outsider, nor a disruptor, but a legal fundamentalist who insisted on the authority of the state being carried out in a lawful manner. The politician and the bureaucrat always have their own reasons to stay outside the law. professing that the interests of the state are paramount. But Noorani Sahib invariably argued that the best interest of the state would, in the long term, get served only if the authority and its coercive instruments were operated within the law. This made him unpopular with each and every establishment of the day. Not that it slowed him in any way down. But as I see it, essentially he was an Ahlite to the core. Many of us would recall the Jawaharlal Nehru's famous formulations. When asked what he thought was his biggest challenge, the then Prime Minister's reply was, creating a just society with just needs. Noorani Sahib was simply implying that the just means could only be legal means, consistent with the constitutional parameters, and no Prime Minister, no politicians, no magistrate, no army colonel, and for that matter, no goon in the state has a right to draw outside the constitutional lines. I'm inclined to end this with a thought. Noorani Sahib would have made an excellent judge on the Supreme Court. But then he would not be, because he would not play by the rules. Had he even done that, he would have found himself most of the time on the losing side as the lone dissenter. Thank you.
Thank you, Haji, for your kind words to A.G Noorani Sahib. I just forgot to mention that we have with us frontline editor Vaishna Rao and senior advocate Bahar Barki. Now, we have a very distinguished speaker and a great friend of A.G Noorani Sahib, Mr. N. Ram. He is not physically with us today, but we have his tributes to Noorani Sahib online. So now I will request, so please play that tributes of N. Ram to audience.
Such a big screen.
My friend A.G Noorani was a journalist, erudite, versatile, brave, fiercely independent, and inexhaustibly productive on issues that matter. Ghafoor was steadfast in his belief in India's Republican Constitution, its inalienable, secular, democratic, and federal or semi-federal basic features. Both as a lawyer and as a journalist, he stood rock-like in his defense of citizens' fundamental rights, the right to equality, the right to freedom of speech and expression, the right to life and personal liberty, protection against arbitrary arrest and detention, the right to freedom of religion, and cultural and educational rights. In his writings, he brought his constitutional and legal expertise to bear on the right to constitutional remedies. When any of these fundamental rights was violated or trodden upon, which happened quite often, he did not spare the offender. This he did without fear or favor. Neither the executive branch, nor the legislature, nor even the courts, if they failed citizens in the matter of respecting and protecting fundamental rights, were spared the transient blade of his criticism, his stern and at times scathing disapproval and chastisement, his meticulously researched and well-documented expose in the long form. Ghaffur was a long-standing and highly valued contributor to Frontline magazine, which the Hindu group launched in 1984. He also wrote for other publications, including the Hindustan Times, the Hindu, the Economic and Political Weekly, and Dainik Bhaskar. I'm not aware of anyone who wrote more articles, usually in the long form, for our magazine. Our archivists inform me that starting with an article titled Taming the RNAW in the issue of April 28, May 11, 1990, and concluding with Gorbachev, an appraisal in the issue of October 7, 2022, A.G Noorani wrote more than 800 articles and book reviews in Frontline. Ghaffur would fight for space, would plan his contributions in advance, and could always be relied on to deliver his copy on deadline. He took issue with any copy editor who dared to make a substantive change, even of a word, without his approval. I recall altering what I thought was a loaded word into something more descriptive in an article he wrote on the India-China border dispute. Sure enough, he remonstrated with the editorial desk and complained to me about the unauthorized change. But when he learned that I was the culprit and had made the small but significant change, he accepted it sportingly with a laugh. Whether he was persuaded I was right or whether he accepted the editing out of personal affection for me, I never found out. What I do know, however, is that he took it as a personal defeat if he ever missed contributing to an issue for whatever reason. Of course, he almost never missed an issue. A veteran journalist, writing admiringly of A.G Noorani's original contributions on Kashmir, and especially his Kashmir formula, recalled an observation I had made several years earlier at a book launch in New Delhi. I had described Ghaffur's ability to find obscure references and documents on an issue that mattered within minutes. I had remarked that he found these references and documents in a way that could not be matched by all the resources we had or could summon within our media organization. This was no hyperbole. It was literally true, whether the subject was the making of the Indian Constitution or Kashmir and its modern political and constitutional history, or Hazarika and his long and checkered political journey, or the RSS, or the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi and the conspirators behind it, or the Babri Masjid, or the India-China boundary dispute, or corruption and ministerial misconduct. One thing I noted with appreciation as an editor was the way in which Ghaffur would push the exercise of freedom of expression right up to the limits prescribed by India's quite illiberal free speech jurisprudence. He did this without ever getting the publication into trouble. His knowledge as a deeply learned lawyer and his experience enabled him to navigate his way with masterful ease through the thicket of legal traps, restrictions, and obstacles that are worked against free speech and press freedom in independent India, and have seen the country's press freedom rankings plummet to abysmal lows during the past decade. I need not dwell on the well-known fact that Ghaffur did original research and wrote learned articles and books on a wide range of subjects, including constitutional questions relating to the President, Parliament and States, the Kashmir dispute, 1947 to 2012, Article 370, the trial of Bhagat Singh and the miscarriage of justice in the colonial legal system, the India-China boundary problem, the RSS and the BJP, Savarkar and Hindutva, the Babri Masjid, ministerial misconduct, and the rights of citizens. Gafur was a wonderful friend, a raconteur, a man of varied interests, although he told me once that he never read fiction in his later years because he had no time for it. He loved to travel to new places.
That was N. Ram from Chennai, former editor-in-chief of Hindu and director now. We have with us a very senior journalist, Saeed Naqvi Saab. Saeed bhai, aap aage tashreef le aaye. Now, our next speaker is Mr. Salman Khursheed. Mr. A.G Noorani was a great champion of minorities' rights, law, justice, jurisprudence, and India's foreign policy. With this background now, I would like to request former Union Minister of Law, Justice, Minority Affairs, and External Affairs, and senior Supreme Court lawyer, Janab Salman Khursheed Sahab.
इज़्ज़त पाक मोहतरम जनाब नायब सदर अंसारी साहब, मेरे यहाँ सारे मोअज़्ज़िज़ दोस्त मौजूद हैं, सभी को मेरा सलाम और आप सभी हज़रात को इत्तेफाक से बद इत्तेफाक मान लीजिए मुझे कभी मौका नहीं मिला कि नूरानी साहब के से रूबरू हो सकता। उनको बहुत जगह देखा, कई जगह पढ़ा, उनकी किताबों को ख़रीदा, पढ़ा, उनको से बहुत कुछ सीखा। लेकिन हमारे यहाँ इतने साथी यहाँ बैठे हैं जिनका ख़ास ताल्लुक़ नूरानी साहब से रहा, उनसे वाबस्तगी रही, उनसे दोस्ती रही, उनसे एक ख़ास रिश्ता रहा। I wasn't so lucky and I consider myself a bit impoverished. I do believe that he was a scholar extraordinary, undoubtedly erudite, courageous, inexhaustible in his research. And that was before Google and the internet, how he would have searched through documents and piles of dust that would have got him to the roots of the issues that he wanted to articulate and write about. Intense passion with which he wrote on the subjects that we are all familiar with. And the range of issues of public intellect, unparalleled, I believe, from his time to ours. He was indeed provocative, though interestingly never treated as being controversial. He's just touched upon subjects that many of us are scared to even touch, and yet despite his very provocative views on many of them, which includes the judiciary that's being talked about, the security personnel, yet he was never treated as being controversial. Something that sticks to us in public life ever so often now. The remarkable variety of the range of subjects that he dealt with in his books have just been talked about. The widely publicized and circulated books that were mentioned, ranging from constitutional issues generally to 370 Ayodhya. And we do know that on subjects as sensitive as the judgment of the Supreme Court in Ayodhya, as indeed the judgments just been mentioned on Hindutva and so on, he took a very strident, very clear, cogent position with which people could disagree, but they were never something that led to any controversy. Of the many books that have been mentioned, and those are books on very important historical subjects, on subject of contemporary history, on subjects of the judiciary, subjects that relate to institutions of our country. There is one book that seems to have gone unnoticed, and if you permit me, I will read a little bit from that book to indicate another dimension of the life of this remarkable man. And that was his ability to find the right person and produce the right biography. He did that for a handful, maybe 2 or 3 people, but one such biography that is out of print and therefore not easily available now was the biography of the 3rd President, my grandfather, Dr. Zakir Hussain. And I just want to read a couple of paragraphs from the end of that biography that gives a sense of what, for him, an important person was, and how he would have chosen the person for whom he wrote that biography. He wasn't easy to please. He was a friend of friends, and not a friend to those that he found unfriendly for their views or for something that they had done. And therefore, I was very, very pleasantly surprised many years ago when I discovered that he had chosen to write about Dr. Zakir Hussain. This is at page 117, where he talks about the background of Dr. Zakir Hussain becoming president and so on. And then he goes on to say, it is the president's profound conviction that the Indian milieu will inspire the bold and the original in Muslim thought, uninfluenced by political considerations of the state. The occasion when he best expressed his views on the subject was when he addressed the University of Cairo on April 6, 1963. Zakir Hussain referred to the advent of Islam in India and said, I quote, "It introduced a new dimension into Indian life and influenced it tremendously. Religion, politics, language and literature were all significantly influenced. No wonder, for the proclaimer of the great message of peace and goodwill was one who, for the first time in human history, had the wisdom and the courage to address all mankind. Ya Ezul, how nice his general form of address, the catholicity of the message and the great assimilative quality of the Indian genius joined to create a situation of great cultural significance. Even today, after the unfortunate partition of the Indian subcontinent, India has no less than 45 million Muslim citizens and so on and so forth." And then he finally sums up at the end by saying, "These views represent no conscious compromise of two extreme beliefs about Islam in India, the one denying it a place in a distinctive element in national life, the other stressing its distinctiveness to the point of exclusive, but Zakir Hussain stressing its distinctiveness to the point of exclusiveness. Zakir Hussain's outlook is rather an integrated one fashioned by his profound conception of Islam as a dynamic religion with a reverence for all time as well as by his contacts with the men who were devout Muslims and yet ardent nationalists. It is an outlook that has emerged out of an entire lifetime devoted to the irreproachable Muslim institution, conceived and sustained in the spirit of Indian nationalism. 5 years ago, Dr. Zakir Hussain spoke at the convocation of the University of Jammu and Kashmir as follows, I quote, "A true university to fashion our future" was the subject of his address. Its central theme was that the purpose of education is to establish a living and fruitful relationship between the growing mind and the goods of culture. He referred to the Jamewar, the pride of Kashmiri craftsmen. It is the expression of a great culture and reveals many things. It reveals in the first place a passion for excellence. Just imagine it, a passion for excellence, and try to imagine how many, or rather how few of us share it and what disastrous consequences that would lead to. We are just out to make the best bargain with life, and a good bargain is one where you give as little as possible to get as much as in return. The bargain Zakir Hussain made with life 47 years ago was of a different quality. To have performed it faithfully is itself no small achievement, but what lends effort to the quality of greatness is the graceful style, the silent address. He was nearly 60 when he last headed an educational institution, a decade of service to the state, and now the presidentship of the Indian Union. The Sheikhul Jamia has become the country's murshid. The assignments have changed. It is certainly not too much to expect that the style will remain the same and the quest for excellence will continue. I do believe this kind of insight for a person, for another person, and projecting it as greatness of the human endeavor is something that is sometimes left unnoticed in the remarkable works that we have seen of Noorani Sahib. And I think it adds a human element to those of us who haven't known him personally, have heard about it, but who haven't experienced it in person. And that human element, I think, is a very significant part of Noorani Sahib, and I salute and acknowledge it. I do believe the message that he's given in this book is a message that remains alive for our times and for the contestations that we face today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Salman Khursheed Saab, for your rich tributes to late A.G Noorani. Friends, we have in our midst Shankar Iyer. Mani Saab, besides being a distinguished former diplomat, parliamentarian and union minister, is a great public intellectual of our time. He was a good friend of A.G Noorani Saab and they had a mutual admiration. Mr. Mani Shankar Iyer.
Friends, one of the advantages of being the last of a long chain of speakers is that they have already told you, my predecessors, the major features of Mr. A. Ghafoor Noorani's life and work. And so I can confine my remarks to my personal interaction with him. Unlike all of them who met Ghafoor themselves as friends, as colleagues, I was introduced to him by his brother who had emigrated to Pakistan and was in Karachi. And it was from Karachi that he let Noorani know that I existed. And that is how, when I returned from Karachi and was made the spokesman of the Ministry of External Affairs, opportunity arose to meet with him. I'm sorry, my phone is ringing, so I'll have to switch that off. I found that talking to Ghafoor was literally like talking to an encyclopedia. He had an amazing head for detail, an amazing memory for dates, a quite astonishing ability to remember the nuances of what he was saying and what other people were claiming. And therefore one approached him not only with humility, but also with a certain inferiority complex. Because there was simply no way in which one could match the depth or width of his knowledge. And he deployed that not in order to show off, but in order to work out the argument, to fill it out. And it is there that I found he had an ability to understand issues that are very rare to come across in anyone else.
Thus, for example, on Kashmir, there was nothing significant about Kashmir or its political personalities or the relevant parts of its history that he was not acquainted with, that where he did not understand the connection between personalities and the policies that evolved, that no event was haphazard, that it was all connected with the persona involved, and that their policies, given who they were, could not be different to what in fact they had been. So this gave him an understanding that many of us would have extreme difficulty in either imitating ourselves or in combating. And the same, I think, is true of his understanding of the India-China border issue. I think if we had actually just handed over to him the responsibility of talking to the Chinese, we might have arrived at a solution not years but decades ago. For he really understood every nook and cranny of that extremely difficult border. He understood what most of us are only very dimly aware of. And above all, he brought no jingoism to bear upon his argument. Unfortunately, far too many Indians are so convinced of their point of view that they don't have the time to understand the nuances of the subject, to understand how the Chinese might look at it, and therefore we tend to talk past each other instead of talking to each other. Equally, on Pakistan, he had a profundity of thought and knowledge that continually astonished me. I found that he had deliberately decided not to go to Pakistan, which is why part of his family was there. I mean, the first Noorani I met was not Ghafoor, but his brother. And he decided that it would not be in keeping with his convictions that he go across for reasons of religion to Pakistan. And so, like several of our Muslim friends here today in this hall, including, I think, Qurban Sahib, he made a conscious decision to remain in India. But the confidence with which he made that decision made it possible for him to not overdo it, to not think in terms of what was wrong with Pakistan so much as to see why it was that they were taking the attitudes that they were taking. And this very meandering course that India-Pakistan relations has taken over decades, he somehow seemed to know every turn in that meandering course. He was very particular in ensuring that the letter of the agreement had to be understood first before you could understand the spirit of it. And so he would insist that one get the letter right. What had been agreed, what was written down, not what we thought was written down, but what was actually written down. And what then were the implications of what had been written down, to the extent that it was possible for him as an outsider to know about the background to a particular formulation, he would use that information, saying that originally the formulation was going to run thus. If eventually it was in this manner that it came to be, then we needed to understand what were the compulsions on either side, the Indian side or the Pakistani side, that made a possible formulation of that point different to the one that was actually made. And this gave a certain subtlety to his thinking that one doesn't come across often enough. At the same time, he was a very gentle man. It was a pleasure being with him because his interests were not confined to what he wrote. He also had a sense of humor. And that too, when he dropped being an encyclopedia and became almost human, at that point you could see that his knowledge of poetry, for example, his knowledge of how to be a good human being, it came through so very clearly. The one thing about him that I was never able to fully comprehend was his being such a natty dresser. So even on the hottest day, he would be wearing a three-piece suit. It would not be made of polyester, it would be made of wool. And as one watched him, he was not sweating, I was sweating. And I was wondering how this human being could live inside the thermal wear that he had on and still survive. But somehow the outside temperature did not seem to touch him because the inner repose was there to keep him cool even when the weather was being unkind. I was very, very sad to hear of his passing away. I was aware, of course, that he was well into his 90s and that where, in fact, today it's become fairly normal for one to cross one's 80s. In fact, I see that a majority of those on this panel have crossed 80 and can confidently look to being 90. Nevertheless, when people like him or my friend Natwar Singh suddenly pass away, it comes as a blow because it reinforces one's own mortality. So I pay my compliments to A.G Noorani. I think we should follow his example to the extent we can. Be very difficult to become a clone of his because he had so much learning and he carried it all in his head and he knew exactly where to look for what. That we can't, all of us, expect to be a walking Noorani. But he did show that it was important to get one's facts right. It was important to get one's dates right. And if you don't get these elementary parameters correctly, then the conclusions that follow are bound to be wrong. So he wasn't fastidious. He wasn't pernickety. He was merely setting the parameters for arguments that would beautifully follow in a completely logical way thereafter and be enlightened with oratorical flourishes that remain in one's mind. Fortunately, I never had to go to him as a lawyer. In fact, I have no desire to be a client of Salman, Khursheed or anybody else. It's good to be out of the hands of the law. But I know people who did turn to him, and he brought his immense legal acumen onto that task. I was not sufficiently familiar with it to be able to talk to you about it. But others like Colin and others who've spoken have explained to you why he was as celebrated a legal luminary as he was. So, paying my tribute to a 95-year-old veteran, I take my leave of you. Thank you very much. Jai Hind.
Thank you very much, Shankar Sahab, for your beautiful tributes to late A.G Noorani Sahab. Friends, we are not mourning the death of A.G Noorani. We are celebrating his versatile personality, and that was his versatile personality, which Shankar ji has just mentioned. We have some other distinguished guests here. Professor Ashish Nandi with us, Justice Anjana Prakash, Captain Parveen Rawal, Partha ji, and many others. Now, for the final words, I would like to invite chairman of this meeting, who was chairman of the Rajya Sabha for 10 long years in his capacity as Vice President of India. It will be transgression on my part if I say something on the relationship and bond they have, which was deep-rooted. Janab Hamid Ansari sahab.
मेरी कैफियत बयान होती है इस कुर्सी से. Friends, we have gathered here to passing away of a unique individual. Ghafoor Sahab was not merely this or merely that. I recall my own friendship with him emanated from our fondness for certain areas of Old Delhi where certain dishes of ancient times could still be located. And yet it didn't remain confined to gastronomic interests. And it was always a pleasure to go to him and seek his views on matters that related whether to India-China relations, India-Pakistan relations, the Kashmir question, or wider questions about the world at large. It is perhaps not known to many people that at a difficult time in India's relations with the United States, Noorani Sahib's advice was sought and appreciated. And he gave advice without going public about it. So he was that kind of a rare genius who could perform public duties and yet retain his own position as an unconnected public individual. In his passing away, we have lost a great personality, somebody who would always be remembered, not only through the compendium of books that he wrote, but for everything that he did in public life. Thank you.
थैंक यू वेरी मच हामिद अंसारी साहब, आप अपनी सेहत और तबीयत नासाज होने के बावजूद तशरीफ़ लाए और नूरानी साहब को आपने खिराज अक़ीदत पेश की, बहुत बहुत शुक्रिया। फ्रेंड्स, नाउ वी आर टुवर्ड्स एंड ऑफ दिस फंक्शन, सो नाउ आई वुड लाइक टू रिक्वेस्ट मिस्टर K.M. Srivastava साहब, डायरेक्टर IIC, for a vote of thanks. It was because of him that IIC provided this opportunity to us to pay our tributes to Noorani Sahab. K.M. Srivastava.
Honorable Hamid Ansari Sahab, former Vice President, dignitaries of the dais, ladies and gentlemen. The speakers have sufficiently spoken about the great personality of A.G Noorani Sahab. I don't have anything further to add. I only say that I associate fully with what has been said about him. He was indeed a great scholar, a veteran journalist, a great lawyer who believed in constitutional values, who wrote very fearlessly. I am one who always read the articles that he wrote in Indian newspapers, Indian magazines. He also used to occasionally write for the popular Pakistani newspaper Dawn. And those articles were, republished by ACNS. I used to make it a point to read those articles also. So he was indeed a great, personality and a true son of India. On this occasion, I would like to thank Hamid Ansari Sahab and all other dignitaries who are present here who were able to take their time out and be with us here. I would like to particularly thank Qurban Bhai, because he is the one who took the initiative and helped us in organizing this memorial meeting. On behalf of India International Center family and my own personal behalf, I pay a rich tribute to Ansari Sahab, to Noorani Sahab. Ladies and gentlemen, I thank all of you for your presence, and I would like to inform you that we have arranged tea for all of you outside in the open veranda. Kindly join us for the tea. Thank you very much.